Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to POMEPS Conversations, our series of discussions with leading scholars of the Middle East. With me today is Lynne Lust of Yale University, one of the leading scholarly experts on political parties, elections, and a whole range of issues in the comparative politics of the Middle East. She also just got back from Jordan, where she was having a look at the latest parliamentary elections. So why don't we start with Jordan. Ellen, tell us a little bit about what you observe in these elections and what do you think it tells us about Jordanian politics?
Okay. Yeah, I was actually in Jordan as part of the Carter study. We actually did a study mission on Jordan. So we were looking at the role of elections in the question of sort of the political process of reform. And so it was partly the study of elections and how they rolled out and were they transparent and what did we know about the system, but it was also interested in the question of how does this election fit into a grander scheme of reform. And so in a sense, one of the things I think that was really interesting about the election was the fact that the election wasn't simply about who was running and how well they were doing at the polls, but it was also about this bigger question that was, whether or not Jordan needed to move more quickly in reform or needed to move more slowly in the reform process as a whole.
And so one of the big issues, of course, was the election law itself and the districting and some of the bigger structural issues about the election.
Exactly. So really, if you think about it, since about 1993, right, the question about the Jordan, in Jordan about the election law has been one of the major issues of contention. The question about what they call the one person, one vote law, which says that, regardless of how many sort of members there are in a district, that you essentially will cast one vote. It's been a way to sort of bring the tribes to power and to try to weaken political parties, a lot of people would argue. That's been associated as well with a lot of gerrymandering, which has tended to overrepresent or more highly represent those who are in the outlying areas, tend to be of East Bank Jordan, East Bank sort of Jordanians. And they have been essentially privileged by the electoral law, whereas those who tend to be in the cities and of Palestinian origin have been sort of underprivileged by the law. So those are the same issues. Like I said, they've been there since 1993. They're the same issues that have been coming up and up and up. And as we'd gone before the elections this year, there had been a point of forming the National Dialogue Committee. There had been essentially a real sort of attempt to revise the electoral law. There is a revision of the electoral law. There's some changes in this law that were different than the last time. But essentially, a lot of the real issues, the malapportionment issues, the questions about, sort of one person, one vote, or one man, one vote, those weren't really addressed, right? Instead, what you got some party, what they called at least party lists initial. It ended up being votes for lists. So there were 27 seats reserved for lists. There was an increase in the number of seats from 120 to 150, so there were more seats. There were 3 new seats added for the women's quota, which are now added into the Bedouin districts. So there were some changes, but none of the changes were the ones that were sort of the most highly desired changes for much of the opposition.
So by the time you get to election day, then most of the work has actually been done.
You could argue that, right? Certainly, if you were in the Independent Electoral Commission, right, which was now just a newly established commission and was trying to demonstrate that it was able to really sort of, put out free and fair elections, or at least the most transparent elections. And that's a big task because in 2007 and in 2010, they had been, in a sense, sort of disasters, right? I mean, they were really, really problematic elections. And so the IEC was intending very much to make sure that the electoral process went cleanly. I think it did, in many ways, a very good job of doing so. But that wasn't the only issue at stake, right? So if you're thinking about the other issues, if you're thinking about the malapportionment issue, if you're thinking about the questions about, sort of the ability of parties or sort of non-tribal factors and elites to get into power, then those issues were essentially already decided by the time you got in the run-up to the electoral.
So election day itself was relatively well managed.
Sort of. In a Jordanian style, it was relatively well managed, which meant that, of course, there were some areas where tribal, conflicts did break out. There were areas of sort of other kinds of electoral campaign violations, et cetera. I think the biggest issue going up to the elections, one that we can't sort of dismiss, was the extent to which vote buying was taking place, right? And so you got,
a lot of discussion of that in the social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was because it was, I think, both very prevalent, right? Maybe even more so than previously. Also because, again, in the context of an election being about whether or not the elections themselves are legitimate, right? Should we think of these as legitimate sort of transfers or decisions of power making, or are they essentially a game and a facade? Then the question of turnout was very much on everybody's mind, right? So people who wanted to say the election succeeded wanted generally to say that they were both relatively clean, right? Which was a reason for the IEC, was a reason for having a lot of attention to international as well as domestic observers. But they also wanted to say that there was a high turnout, that people came out to vote, right? It's because that sort of undermines the opposition, right? If the opposition,
56% is pretty high.
56% is pretty high, although there was a change in the registration law. So in the previous elections, everybody essentially was registered, right, on just a national identity card. Now you actually had to register and get a sort of an electoral registration. So 70% of the people who were eligible had registered, okay? And there was a lot of push to make sure that people were registered, because you couldn't, essentially there's a two-phase process, right? The first one was to make sure enough people were registered that the opposition couldn't say, see, these were meaningless elections. And then the second phase was to make sure enough people voted so that they couldn't say, see, these were meaningless elections. So the registration, there are three things I think happened that are worth recognizing. One was that there were liaisons put in some of the public enterprises who went around and said, hey, I can help you register. You'd like to register, wouldn't you, right? So there was a real attempt at making sure that the registration process.
But that's good, right? You want people to register to vote.
You would think so, right? You would think so generally, and I'm not against registration or having participation, but it is interesting when people feel a little that they're almost coerced into registering, right? Okay. Because they recognize that their boss knows if they did or didn't register, and their boss is linked to the state, and the state wants them to register. So I think that becomes a bit of a problem. There were rumors that went around, especially in the Palestinian communities, that said people who weren't going to register would lose their ID cards, right, or would lose their numbers, which of course gives them access to all sorts of things, right? Healthcare, education, et cetera. It's a major, major issue. And in the past few years, there have been people, probably for legitimate reasons, who have lost their numbers, right? So it seems like a credible threat. It seems like a threat. You can't say this came from the state, but you can say certainly that the rumor went around, and that also had a kind of an impetus for registration. And then the third thing they did, I think, that was interesting, was they actually started to very loosely define a kind of a family registration system. So it's always the case that I can go, if you're my father or my mother and basically my siblings and my kids, I can register. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I can take the family book down. I can say, here's the people in my family book. They can say, here's your 12 registration cards, or here's your 45 registration cards. And then, now think about what that does. In part, that means it's really easy to do vote buying, right? I got 45 cards for you, right? But the other thing it means is that people ended up registering who didn't necessarily want to be registered, right? So, and again, it's not that registration is bad. It's in this context of where it's about a bigger debate over participation and legitimacy that you start to have some questions, I think.
So what about the boycott by the Islamic Action Front? Did it have any effect?
Well, that's a really good question, right? So there were people who will tell you it didn't, or people who will say the reason it didn't have any effect is because the Islamists are really weak, right? So they didn't want to run because they were too weak to win, right? And look, the evidence of this is that in the boycott, we still have really high turnout figures. So clearly they don't have power. So that's one side of the story. Other people will say, no, it's not that they didn't have an effect. The problem was that, what happened was that money flowed like water, right? So lots of people were sort of either, coerced and pushed into registration and then, had some of the same fears going into voting, or, they were essentially sort of bought. And that there was too little of an attempt to try to stop that because the state was very interested in seeing high figures.
Is there any argument to be made that the Brotherhood accomplished anything through its boycott?
I don't know that you can make an argument that it accomplished in the short run anything in the boycott. It certainly brought a lot of attention to the elections. It certainly made people very aware of the issues at stake. I think you can say that the elections themselves may have had an effect both on the opposition as well as on sort of the hardliners of the state. Mm-hmm. I think it's a bit of a worry, but on the opposition, there is a sense that our boycott should have had more of an impact than it did. right? And that legitimately it did have more of an impact, except for you didn't see it, right? And I think you're going to talk about it in a second, but there's reasons why the electoral law itself actually, I think, increased the turnout. So essentially, a figure today, saying 56% voted today versus, 52% previously, isn't really the right comparison because there's too many other things that changed, right? But the opposition has become now really, really unhappy because, from their perspective, this has undermined them. And even some of the sort of more kind of moderate opposition or reformers are unhappy with the way that things just went.
What about like the youth protest movement?
So the youth protest movement, I mean, a lot of them would tell you even before the elections took place, as soon as these elections take place, we're going to call for the government to be torn down, right? I mean, so they weren't, and you would say, is there any way that you can imagine a legitimate parliament will be elected? This is before the elections. And they would say, absolutely not. There is no legitimate parliament that can be elected in this system. So there was a set of people, right, who were dismissive from the outset, and nothing was going to change their mind. There was a set of people, I think, who wanted to see, they participated, they were hoping for reform, they were hoping for the best. I think a lot of them have become very, very unhappy. Some of them were leading, heading national lists and thought they would get 9 seats. The only list that got 3 seats was the Islamic Wasat Party. There's, I think it's 3 or 4 seats, the 4 lists that got 2 seats, and then everybody else got 1. So those are as fragmented as ever, and people felt very frustrated with that as well. So there's a set of reformists who become, I think, less happy. And then there's a set of hardliners who've decided this has actually proved their point. That, see, there's nobody out there to really boycott. There's no real reason to worry. We can go on sort of with business as usual.
So the regime presents this as, the palace presents this as the first step towards meaningful, comprehensive reform, new elections for a new era, and then the parliament selects as its speaker Saad al-Sarur, who is now the speaker for the 6th time, former Minister of the Interior, which doesn't exactly scream, a bold step forward.
No.
So what do you expect from the parliament? I guess maybe this will be our last question, is the king has also indicated that for the first time he'll consult with parliament about the selecting of a prime minister. Is there any chance that this new parliament will actually be kind of more politically relevant than previous parliaments?
Yeah, obviously, there's always a chance, and you can always hope that there's a sort of a real sort of impetus in that direction. I mean, what was interesting about the argument that we'll consult with Parliament is it also came hand in hand with one that said, we will expect the Parliament to return a majority bloc, right? And if you can do that, then you can pick the government. You've had an election which, very much like the elections in the last, roughly 20 years, has returned a parliament that is very fragmented, that is very personalistic, that is, essentially anything but strong parliamentary blocks, and certainly not a majoritarian one, which is hard to achieve in the best of the world. And so, in a sense, it's put the onus on Parliament to say, you guys do your job well, and then you'll have a large role to play, but you've created a parliament that is not likely to be able to do the job well, right? So I think one has to hope that people see sort of the importance of having reform at this moment, but there's no really great push in that direction.
All right, thank you. Lynne Lust of Yale University, back from Jordan with the grim news.
Thank you.
Ellen.
Thanks for having me.